fought to liberate Kenya from colonial rule. The great giant and legendary figure, Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi, the Commander-in-Chief of the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, also known as the Mau Mau, who was executed by the British colonial government 57 years ago today. Kimathi famously said, "It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees." He's a true hero who has paid the ultimate price for his nation and country. It is the enormous sacrifices that Kimathi and others made which eventually led to our freedom in 1963. The second one, of course, is the launch of Professor Maina Kinyatti's pioneering book, Mwakenya the Unfinished Revolution. It is also wonderful to be here among many comrades and friends in the protracted struggle for freedom, democracy, justice, equity, a better life for all, and above all, for human dignity. I can see many of you here. I acknowledge Onyango, Mandawira Maganga, Professor Uyugi, Oduor, whom I haven't seen for quite a while, at the back. I also acknowledge Mohammed Abdullahi, who was actually present, and Jerusha Kasri, actually. They were present when we launched Kenya on the 18th of February 1987 in London. So it is really, when some friends from BBC and other places. I'm grateful to see a well-representative delegation from Kamukunji. I would also like to salute the many heroes and heroines, although Anyango tells me they're Shirions, is it? Shirions of the struggle for change in our country. The list is very long, but allow me to mention and remember some of. I also want to acknowledge Zarina Patel, my sister. There are many, but I would like to mention some of the gallant activists whom I had the privilege to work with during the exile years, who are no longer with us. Wajiru Kihoro, Paddy Onyango Sumba, Ngugi wa Miri, Mwakandua Machofi, Kariuki Wangondu, John LaRose from Trinidad and also Britain. He was the chairman of the first organization for the release of political prisoners, who hosted us in London, and Tajuddin Abdurrahman from Nigeria. These were comrades from other countries who had come into solidarity with us. And I wanted to mention some few things about Grenada, because we had international solidarity. We were supported by many sister organizations and leaders during the exile years. Maurice Bishop, at that time, was at the University of London, the London School of Economics. He was a member of the Committee for the Release of Political Prisoners, who campaigned for the release of people like Professor Maina Kinyatti, Edward Oyugi, and many other political prisoners under the Moi regime's prison. We had many support from around the world, in big numbers, in fact. And Maurice Bishop went for the Grenada Revolution. I had the privilege of visiting Grenada when he was the Prime Minister, a true people's revolution, and it was really sad that he was violently overthrown and killed by reactionary forces. I would also like to acknowledge the key role of the revolutionary thinker, leader and teacher, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I don't mention him as a writer because I think the emphasis is on his writing, not in his political activism, in which he has played a leading role in the liberation of our country. I would speak more about Professor Maina Kinyatti. I acknowledge our national poet and freedom fighter, Abdul Latif Abdallah, and other stalwarts in the long struggle for change, people like Shiraz Durrani, Wangui Wagoru, and Nish Matendwe. These are men and women who have stood the test of time and continue the struggle in a sad and difficult time in our history. That period was a very lonely period. As you know, many people were frightened of the consequences of standing up against a very vicious, very brutal system that was jailing people, killing people, and causing a lot of other people to flee the country. Kenya has long attracted foreign predators in search of slaves and resources to exploit. For centuries, Arabs, Persians, and Europeans have come to our shores. In the 15th century, Yusuf Hassan dealt a major blow to Portuguese colonial design when he defeated a force of Portuguese invaders in Mombasa. Portugal was then a preeminent European power. It was the America of that time. In 1884-85, leading European powers including Britain, France, Portugal, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands gathered in Berlin, where they agreed on a grand plan to carve up the African continent, thus sparking the struggle for Africa, a new imperial conquest and colonization of African territory. Kenya came under British control. They came to take the land, exploit the resources and the labor of the country under the pretext of civilizing the heathens, primitives and savages, and spread Christianity. By 1920, Kenya was converted into a British colony, and so started the long struggle for independence and self-determination. Super exploited and their traditions and culture eradicated and replaced by an Anglo-centric faith culture. The population was overworked, overtaxed, and humiliated, leading to widespread poverty and hunger. People could no longer tolerate the unbearable living conditions they were forced to live under. And under these inhumane, brutal conditions, the stage was set for the emergence of an anti-imperialist nationalist organization. While there were many leaders and organizations that developed in opposition to the colonial rule, the most significant was the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s. This was by far the most sophisticated revolutionary organization with a complex military structure and political strategies and tactics to come out of colonial Kenya. It quickly spread its wings to central Kenya, parts of the Rift Valley and Nairobi, and became a formidable force for social change and a major challenge to the British colonial rule in Kenya. To counter the growing strength and support of the Mau Mau, the colonial state used widespread repression between 1950 and 59 under the state of emergency. The colonial forces were permitted to shoot to kill. Thousands of Kenyans were shot on sight. It was a period of much bloodshed and unspeakable atrocities. And I think this is a period that has been documented very well, as I will later mention, by Professor Maina wa Kinyatti. And I think this is where they say, until the lions write their own history, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And in this particular case, we appreciate that the lion is now writing his own story and not the hunter. The struggle for democracy and equality and social justice in Kenya has unfolded over many decades, starting most importantly in recent history with the Mau Mau, the nationalist strivings of the 1960s, and the long-drawn clamor for multi-party democracy and constitutional reform over the last 25 years. There have been heroes and heroines celebrated and immortalized in song, poetry, and even statuettes erected in their honor. But one epoch in that epic story of Kenya's freedom fight has almost been erased by later-day chroniclers of our history. That is the period of the resistance movement against the KANU one-party tyranny from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. This is the golden age of the Kenyan underground movement, when disciplined, militant, patriotic comrades were fighting for a new Kenya. They didn't just want change in Kenya. They demanded a revolutionary transformation of Kenya and a people in Kenya that will bring the oppressed from their own downtrodden status to the top, where the ordinary women and men of Kenya, the poor and the marginalized youth, the exploited villagers in the peasant countryside, and the disenfranchised workers in the urban slums will be holding the steering wheel, guiding Kenya to a new democratic future. The leaders of the clandestine struggles were revolutionaries committed to a socialist vision. It is their organized and steely opposition which was to lay the seeds for the powerful, open, and massive democratic upsurge of the early 90s, when new leaders from the faith movement, the lawyers, and professionals, the journalists, and other middle-class reformers could now demand the return of political pluralism, the formation of a broad church of opposition. Yet when in 2010, when Kenyans celebrated the launch of the new constitution, hardly anybody mentioned them. It was as if they did not exist, had never lived, let alone striking a single blow for progressive change. Luckily for them, for Kenya, for posterity, they have a writer who is determined to make sure that their glorious chapter is not ripped from the history of Kenya, a history written with their blood, tears, their sweat and sacrifices. Maina wa Kinyatti, earlier in his life, when he was a student in the United States, was the president of the Pan-African Student Organization. He was involved in the Black Power movement. He came home in 1974, and others, and secretly formed the underground movement, the first underground movement, as he has told us this evening. And he was a student activist. Maina wa Kinyatti has taught at Kenyatta University and was for many years a professor at Hunter's College in New York. He's a political activist who was jailed for 6 years by the Moi Kanu regime. He was kept in a small dark room and almost lost his sight. Thank God he didn't, because he would not have published the many publications that he was lost. He's the director and the founder of the Mau Mau Research Center, dedicated to collecting, analyzing, interpreting and publishing the history of progressive, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and anti-new colonial movements and organizations in Kenya. He's the author of some of the most outstanding publications on the history of the Kenyan people, including Thunder from the Mountain, Mau Mau, the Revolution Betrayed, Kenya, a Prison Notebook, Mother Kenya, Letters from Prison 1982 to 1988, A Season of Blood, Toiled through the Kenyan prisons. Indeed, Professor Kinyatti, a committed writer and researcher, is the people's historian. His seminal book, Mau Mau, The Revolution Betrayed, narrated the heroic struggle of the Kenyan Freedom Land and Freedom Army against the British forces and their local collaborators. He has enormously contributed to our knowledge and understanding of this important movement and its crucial role in the colonial campaign of the Kenyan people. He has done it again with his latest publication, Mwakenya the Unfinished Revolution, on the neo-colonial period, documenting the repressive actions and policies of the Kanu regimes and the responses of the Kenyan people, which led to the rise of several underground movements and the struggle for radical change, climaxing in the birth of Mwakenya and leading to the demise of the Moi Kanu regime in 2002. This is a massive book. The 440 pages divided into 6 parts. After the preface and introduction, part 1 deals with the birth of the Kenya underground movement in the mid-1970s, around the time of the brutal and grisly murder of the populist parliamentarian JM Kariuki. Drawing its inspiration and legacy from the Mau Mau struggle of the 1950s, the December 12 movement, DTM, derived its name from the date Kenya achieved flag independence. DTM, in turn, was the baby of the clandestine Workers' Party of Kenya, whose founding leaders were Maina wa Kinyatti himself, Kamoji Wachiira, Adhu Awiti, Amin Kassam, Koigi wa Umere, and later Willy Mutunga, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Alamin Mazrui, Alamin Mazrui, Edward Oyugi, Shiraz Durrani, Sultan Somjee, Ngodho wa Kariuki, the late Ngugi wa Miri, Kuria Muriimi, Kariuki Kiboi, and others. The fledgling underground movement took an anti-imperialist, pro-socialist stance, ideology anchored in Marxism-Leninism Maoist thought. The movement was to later launch communication organs and newspapers, journals and publications like Mwanguzi, Pambana, and Cheche. At the cultural level, the author informs us that DTM was the organizing force behind such militant and patriotic plays like Ngahika Ndenda and the Fire of Dead and Kimadi, which I was fortunate to see when I was a student here in the National Theatre, which is right opposite here. The movement mobilized progressive lecturers, organized well-attended public symposia at the campuses of the burning issues of the day. It recruited students and open-minded and radical members of the petty bourgeoisie into its secret ranks, before its top leadership was arrested and detained in June 1982. DTM, through its secret organizations, typed, written, cyclostyle, photocopied, and staple newspaper called Pambana, which was surreptitiously circulated under the very nose of the secret police. I was also fortunate to get the first edition of Pambana when I was in London and we launched the Committee for the Release of Political Prisoners. It was one of the campaigning documents that we have used as part of our work when we were in exile. The movement had arrived in the ranks of the opposition at a time when the Moi Kanu one-party dictatorship was smugly assuring itself that it had politically throttled all the voice of dissent. Kinyatti reveals how even behind prison walls and exile, DTM continued to grow, recruiting within its ranks a militant university student jailed on sedition charges. The author states that in 1984, the movement morphed from the founder members of DTM mentioned in the book. The rest of part one is taken by a detailed narrative as well as very frank analysis and critique of the later history of the movement when, according to the author, it was taken over by what he refers to as opportunists, sectarians, and ultra-leftists, who later transformed it into Mwakenya, with at first disastrous consequences. Kenyatta also records the inner party debate, struggle, and gratification, which later led to the expulsion of those elements. Part 2, which spans 137 pages, showcases the DTM publications from 1974 to 1985, reproducing several copies of Mwanguzi, Pambana, Mpatanishi, occasional anonymous leaflets, and other communiques and statements from the movement. Part 3 provides a selection of Mwakenya documents covering the period from 1987 to 2001, including internal position papers, statements, study group observations, and reflections. Part 4 lays bare in the public domain in the first time outside the closed circle of Kenyan exiles and activists in Britain and the United States, excerpts from the archives of Kenya, formed in the UK in the 1980s to confront the Moi dictatorship. Among the Ukenya documents to be found in is its 1987 manifesto, which we used to launch the movement both in London and other centres where there were Kenyans. A public address in London by Ukenya chairman at that time, myself, a speech delivered by Abdul Latif Abdallah at the 7th Pan-African Congress held in Kampala in April 1994. Abdul Latif took over the leadership of the movement from me. He became the chairman of Umoja Kenya and had continued to advance the work of the organization. Part 5, beginning on page 417, resolved to clarify the name of the party and called it DTM Mwakenya, so as to reflect correctly the history, continuity, and the mainstreams that have gone into making it. Part 6 is an appendix consisting of the DTM Mwakenya study guide, broken down to organizational aspects like the concepts of the unity of theory and practice, democratic centralism, criticism and self-criticism, dialectical and historical materialism, classes and history, the national question, the religion, the women question, on the state, historical aspects, Africa and Kenya. The book ends with suggested selected reading material on general history, the Mau Mau struggles, critical and ideological literature, prison writings, and DTM Mwakenya underground publications. Kinyatti provides a remarkable insight into the political history of this volatile period in our country.